You know, what we decide to eat feels like such a personal choice, right? It's about taste, it's about health. But what if I told you that every single bite you take connects you to this massive, global story? A story about money, about politics, about power? Well, today we're going to peel back the layers on the hidden life of your food.
Just for a second, think about the last meal you ate. Where did it really come from? I don't just mean the supermarket. I mean the seed, the farm, the factory. For most of us, let's be honest, that's a total mystery. But that story, that is the hidden wiring of our entire modern world. And to understand it, we don't need some fancy exotic dish. All we have to do is look at something incredibly simple.
I mean, come on. What could be more basic than a bowl of cornflakes? It's just corn, right? Maybe a little sugar, you add some milk, done. But that simple bowl, that's actually a masterpiece of industrial engineering. It's a focal point for global economics, politics, and power.
Okay, let's just deconstruct one single bite. The corn? It almost certainly came from a patented seed owned by one of just a handful of huge global companies. It was grown using synthetic fertilizers, and get this, that technology came directly from munitions plants right after World War II. Then, that corn was harvested, thrown in with corn from countless other anonymous farms, shipped through a massive global supply chain, and finally industrially processed into the little flakes that end up in your bowl.
And this really just nails it. The whole food system is, as the philosopher Julian Baggini puts it, the hidden wiring of our modern life. It's the engine that keeps everything running, but it's an engine most of us never even think to look at, until, of course, it starts to break down. So what kind of world has this engine actually built for us?
Well, it's created a world of frankly unbelievable contradictions. A planet that is, at the exact same time, both stuffed and starved. Just look at this paradox. It's wild. On one hand, you've got our supermarkets, overflowing with more variety than a king could have dreamed of 100 years ago. We're getting agricultural yields that are just mind-blowing. But on the other hand, a staggering 3.1 billion people, that's more than a third of the entire world, cannot afford a healthy diet. And while all that's happening, millions of tons of grain can literally be left to rot in silos. So our global food system, it isn't just failing to feed the hungry. It's actually creating two opposite crises at once. In 2022, the UN found that over 9% of the world's population was undernourished. But at the same time, the World Health Organization found that 39% of adults were overweight or obese. The result? We now have more people living in countries where being overweight kills more people than being underweight. Think about that.
So this is the big question, right? How on earth do we build a system that manages to both stuff and starve people, often in the very same communities? This goes so much deeper than simple ideas about personal choice. The answer is baked into the very logic of the machine that makes our food.
To really find the answer, we've got to pop the hood and look at the architecture of the system itself. Let's call it the industrial food machine.
And as the writer Michael Pollan explains so well, if you want to understand the industrial food chain, you have to understand one plant, corn. Corn isn't just a vegetable weed. No way. It's the keystone of our entire modern diet. It feeds the cattle that become our burgers, it's processed into the high-fructose corn syrup in our sodas, and it makes up the bulk of countless processed foods you see on the shelves. And this didn't just happen by accident. Back in 1947, all that industrial power built up for World War II had to go somewhere. So munitions plants started cranking out chemical fertilizers, and that changed farming forever. Then, in the 60s, you get the Green Revolution. It doubled food production, which sounds great, but as scholars like Rob Wallace point out, it also fueled malnourishment by pushing out diverse local crops in favor of high-yield staples. By the 1980s, the logic of the factory had completely taken over the kitchen, with processed foods designed for maximum convenience, not maximum nutrition.
The one big idea that drives this whole machine is something called monoculture. It's a simple industrial concept, really. Simplify everything, make it all uniform, and you can maximize your output. So instead of complex, diverse farms, you get these endless massive fields of just one single crop, like corn. And sure, it's really efficient at pumping out cheap calories, but it's also incredibly fragile. And it comes with a very steep price.
And here's that price tag. This system absolutely wrecks soil health, it leads to massive losses in biodiversity, and it's completely hooked on fossil fuels for fertilizer and for transport. It cuts the connection between the people who grow our food and the people who actually eat it. And ultimately, it creates what Michael Pollan calls the industrial eater, and that's us. We've become people who are adapted to eating these processed fractions of corn, totally disconnected from where our own food actually comes from.
So this machine is great at producing cheap calories, but it's doing it at the expense of our health and the health of the planet. And that brings up a really critical question. In a system like this, who gets a real seat at the table and who ends up getting the blame?
You know, the first instinct is always to blame the individual, right? To talk about personal choice. But that completely ignores the powerful forces, these structural and cultural politics that are shaping what we eat. The conversation is almost never just about nutrition. It's really about power, it's about class, and it's about race.
And this is where the story gets so much more interesting, because food is never, ever just fuel. As the historian Psyche Williams-Forson shows, for Black women in America, food, and chicken in particular, has historically been a powerful tool. It actually became a way to gain economic independence in a system that was trying to deny them every other opportunity.
And what this shows us is that food is a battlefield. It's a place of struggle, a place of self-definition. People use it to push back against stereotypes, to hold on to cultural traditions, and just to survive economically. A lot of the time, arguments about what we should be eating are actually fights about class, about who's respectable, and about who gets to define themselves.
So when you start putting all these different pieces together, the industrial logic, the political fights, the cultural meanings, you start to realize we're not just talking about a system.
Julian Baggini suggests a much better term for it: the food world. See, a system sounds like a machine out there, something external that we just interact with. But a food world? That's an ecosystem that we are always inside of. It completely reframes how we think. It's not a technical problem we need to solve. It's an environment whose values and ethics we have to navigate. And this food world that we're all living in, it is just defined by these deep, constant tensions. The system promises us abundance, but the reality is a fight for justice. It promises us cheapness, but that often comes at the cost of dignity for workers and for animals. It promises efficiency, but that can so easily lead to exploitation. And it promises us endless consumer choice, when in reality our choices are shaped by some incredibly powerful structural forces. All of this forces us to take a huge step back and ask one final, really fundamental question. With all this in mind, what is food actually for in our society?
Is the whole point of food just to produce the absolute maximum number of cheap calories, no matter the cost? Or is it for something more? These are the real questions we have to start asking. Who controls our food? Who's profiting from it? Who's doing the hard labor? And most importantly, what kind of society does all of that create?
Ultimately, the next meal you sit down to eat is an intensely private act. But it is also a profoundly political one. It's something we do every single day, and at the same time, it's part of a huge civilizational project. Understanding that connection, that's the first real step toward reclaiming not just our health, but the true meaning of our food.
嗨，大家好，我每天都要吃饭嘛，对不对？但你有没有停下来想过，你眼前这一餐，不管是早餐、午餐还是晚餐，它的背后其实藏着一个超级复杂的世界。一个由劳工、大公司、法律，甚至是文化跟权力全部交织在一起的世界。所以，我们今天就是要来聊聊这个问题。答案可能比你想的还要复杂，还要惊人。因为我们吃下的每一口食物，说穿了，其实就是整个社会的缩影。
好，第一部分，你餐点中的世界。那我们就先从一个大家可能每天都会吃的东西开始吧。一个看起来再也简单不过的早餐，我们来把它拆解看看，看它到底能告诉我们什么故事。
好，现在请你想象一下一碗玉米片，听起来很普通，对吧？但你知道吗？有一位哲学家叫朱利安·巴吉尼，他去分析了这碗玉米片，结果发现，哇，这根本就是全球化的一个迷你模型嘛！
你看这清单是不是超乎想象？光是为了我们早上那碗玉米片，你想想看，它的源头是那些大公司手上的专利种子，还要用上合成肥料跟农药。种植它的机器是来自一个全球化的网络，然后你加进去的牛奶是透过一个国际供应链送来的。还没完哦，里面那些标榜营养强化的维生素，那是在专业实验室里做出来的。最后，所有这些东西还要经过超复杂的运输、包装，还要无数劳工的手，才终于能送到你家餐桌上。
哇，这么庞大、这么复杂的一个全球网络，其实学术上有个专有名词啦，就叫做食物系统。简单来说，它就是
把食物从田里、从工厂一路送到我们嘴巴里，这中间所有的人事物，所有的环节加起来就是食物系统。好，第二部分丰饶的悖论，这就有趣了。我们这个现代的食物系统啊，其实存在一个非常核心的矛盾，那就是我们生产的食物明明就比历史上任何一个时候都还要多到吃不完，但为什么这个世界上还是有这么多人吃不饱、营养不良？你看，这个对比就很强烈了。一方面，我们有这个所谓的绿色革命，听起来很棒，对吧？它让我们的粮食产量真的是翻倍再翻倍。但另外一方面呢，怪了，饥饿、营养不良，甚至还有肥胖问题，这三样东西竟然同时在全世界恶化，这不是很奇怪吗？到底哪里出错了？
有个概念，或许可以帮我们解开这个谜题，它叫做杰文斯之悖论。一位叫罗布·华莱斯的科学家就用了这个理论。他的意思大概是这样：当你做一件事的效率变高了，照理说应该会用的比较少，对吧？但结果正好相反，效率越高，反而刺激你用的越多，消耗的越多。所以套到食物上就是，我们生产粮食的效率变高了，结果呢，我们没有因此解决饥饿问题，反而造成了整个系统的过度消耗，还给环境带来超大的压力。
所以你看哦，这个悖论就制造出了两种人，两种同时存在的危机，一种是过饱的人，另一种是饥饿的人。作家拉吉·帕特就说得很好，他说，饥饿和肥胖，你不要把它们看成是两个不相干的问题，不，它们其实是同一个坏掉的、失衡的系统所产生出来的两种病症而已。好，第三部分，食物背后的人。我们刚刚谈了很多系统面的东西，听起来可能有点抽象，但现在我们要把镜头拉近，来看看人。因为我们吃的每一口食物里面，其实都藏着很多人的过世，很多常常被我们忘记、被我们忽视的生命故事。这里有一个非常动人的故事，可以让我们感受一下。故事发生在美国内战刚结束的时候，在一个叫戈登斯维尔的小镇。当时有一群非裔的女性，她们被称作适应携带者。她们做什么呢？她们就在火车站把食物卖给来来往往的旅客。在那个年代，她们可以说是靠着自己的双手，成为了一群了不起的创业家。
其中一个女儿后来回忆说，我妈妈是用鸡腿买下了我们这个家。哇，这句话是不是很有力量？它让我马上就明白，这些女性卖的每一份食物，每一个鸡腿，不只是为了赚钱糊口而已，不是的。她们是在为自己、为家人争取一个真正的家，一个可以安身立命的地方。她们是在争取经济上的独立，还有整个家庭的未来。
所以你看，对这些女性来说，鸡肉这个我们觉得很普通的食物，变成了一种非常有力量的工具。它让她们能够经济独立，可以买房子、做生意。她们还用赚来的钱去支持教会，建设自己的社区。更重要的是，在那个对他们充满限制、充满歧视的社会里，卖食物这件事本身就是一种抵抗，是在为自己争取自主权和尊严。所以你看，食物的意义真的远远超过填饱肚子这么简单。好，第四部分，选择的幻觉哦。我们来聊聊选择这件事。我们每天去超市、去餐厅，好像有很多选择，对吧？但我们真的有选择吗？我们的选择真的有我们想的那么自由吗？你可以想象你家附近，为什么有些社区走没几步就是一家素食店，汉堡、炸鸡、薯条，但另外一些社区却有那种很新鲜、很健康的农夫市集？这个差别其实不是巧合哦，这背后有一股很巨大的系统性的力量在运作。也就是说，你家附近能买到什么食物，可能早就被决定好了。我们来看这段历史。根据一位学者的研究，这一切其实跟政策有很大的关系。时间回到1960年代的美国，当时很多城市发生了暴动，特别是在非裔社区，凸显了贫穷跟经济机会不平等的问题。那后来联邦政府就想了一个办法，他们想推动所谓的黑人资本主义，希望可以稳定社会。那怎么做呢？刚好素食公司那时候也想扩张市场，于是双方一拍即合。 政府开始大力支持，甚至贷款给素食连锁店，鼓励他们到市市中心去开店，说这样可以发展经济，创造就业机会。
这个支持有多大的力呢？我们来看一个数字：2960万美金。到1979年的时候，光是麦当劳这一家公司就从政府那边拿到了将近3000万美金的贷款担保。这数字很惊人吧？它非常清楚地告诉我们，政府是直接下场参与，去塑造了某些社区的饮食地图。
所以结论是什么？结论就是一个社区的菜单长什么样子，并不是居民自己喜欢吃什么这么简单，很多时候是政策决定的。而当一个地方的食物环境是被政策这样刻意打造出来的时候，那住在里面的人，他们个人的选择其实就变得非常非常有限了。
好，来到我们最后一个部分，食物、羞耻与权利。我们来聊点更深层的。食物不只是食物，它还承载了很多社会跟情感上的意义。其中一个就是我们常常会用食物来评判别人，甚至制造出一种羞耻感。刚刚提过的那位学者赛基·威廉斯·佛森，他提出了一个很棒的概念，叫做美食监控。这是什么意思呢？意思就是我们的社会会去偷偷的观察、监视，甚至管束别人吃什么、怎么吃，用这种方式来确保每一个人都符合某一种正常的标准。这是一种看不见的社会控制。
那谁最容易被这样监控呢？通常就是那些我们前面讲的饮食选择本来就很少的人。这很不公平，对吧？明明他们的饮食习惯是被整个大系统给塑造出来的，但最后被骂、被指责的却是他们个人。比如说，非裔的饮食文化就常常被贴上不健康的标签，被大家指指点点，甚至有些人的身材还会被当成是他们道德有问题的证据。这种指责完全忘记了我们刚刚才讲过的，那些真正决定了他们能吃什么的是政策，是经济力量啊。
所以这位学者就问了一个非常尖锐的问题：为什么我们非裔美国人会变成大家目光的焦点？为什么每个人都觉得自己有权利可以来评论我们的饮食习惯？这句话一针见血地点出了这种对食物的监控背后其实就是种族跟权力的问题。为什么总是某些特定族群的饮食会被放大检视，会被拿来批判？这绝对不是偶然的。所以我们聊了这么多，其实可以得到一个结论：我们的餐桌就是整个社会的缩影。虽然那些听起来很遥远、很抽象的东西，像是经济啊、政治啊、种族啊、权力啊，这些巨大的力量，最终就是透过我们每天吃的饭、喝的汤，用一种最个人、最亲密的方式渗透到我们的生活里，变成我们生命的一部分。
所以最后，我想留给大家一个问题，回去好好想一想。下次你坐下来吃饭的时候，无论你吃的是什么，你可以看看你盘子里的东西，然后问问自己，它在告诉我什么故事？因为我们吃的每一口食物都不只是一顿饭，它其实都在揭露我们亲手打造出来的这个社会究竟是什么样子，它又是一个什么样的世界。
So, I want you to imagine for a second that you're just walking into a modern supermarket.
Okay, yeah.
The automatic doors slide open, and you get that familiar blast of, like, climate-controlled air.
Right. And suddenly you're just bathed in that really dazzling fluorescent light.
Exactly. So you grab a shopping cart, and you're immediately greeted by the produce section. You've got the misters gently spraying the organic kale.
Perfect. Unblemished pyramids of apples.
Yeah, stacked up like artillery shells and, exotic fruits flown in from 3 continents away.
It's overwhelming.
It really is. And then you move into the interior aisles, and you're looking at tens of thousands of individual products.
Mm-hmm.
There's an entire 50-foot wall dedicated strictly to different formulations of potato chips.
And another whole wall just for breakfast cereals.
Right, and standing there, placing a box of cookies or a bag of carrots into your cart, you probably make this very intuitive, completely understandable assumption.
Which is what?
You assume that what you are choosing to put into your body is simply a matter of your own personal taste, right? Your household budget and your own unencumbered free will.
Well, and that is arguably the most successful consumer illusion of the modern era.
An illusion.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
we are totally conditioned to view our diets as these highly individualized, almost intimate expressions of who we are.
We think we're making autonomous choices.
Exactly. We think it's all up to us. But when we look at the structural reality of how that supermarket actually came to be, we have to completely shatter that illusion.
Which is exactly the mission of our deep dive today.
Right. The core thesis here is that food is never just food.
Never.
Every single bite you take, whether you are unwrapping a fast food cheeseburger in your car or, slicing into an organic heirloom tomato in a pristine kitchen,
It's all connected.
it is the end product of a massive invisible web. A web of corporate power, profit mandates, class divisions, racial hierarchies, global labor markets, and intense political struggle.
And the sheer scale of that invisible web is, honestly, it's almost impossible to visualize when you're just trying to figure out what to help for dinner.
Too big.
Right. So to give us a mental map for this conversation, I want to borrow a really brilliant visual metaphor from the sociological research we're looking at today.
Raj Patel's concept.
Yes. Think of the entire global food system as an hourglass.
Picture the shape of that hourglass.
Right.
Up at the very top, in that wide upper bulb, you have millions and millions of farmers, agricultural workers, and migrant laborers.
Scattered all across the globe.
Right. These are the human beings who are physically interacting with the soil, pulling our calories from the earth. And overwhelmingly, the people in that top bulb are economically precarious.
Underpaid and struggling.
Exactly. Struggling to maintain their livelihoods against massive environmental and financial pressures.
And then down at the very bottom in the other wide bulb, you have billions of eaters.
That's us, the consumers.
Right. And paradoxically, that bottom bulb is filled with people who are simultaneously overfed and severely undernourished.
But, the defining feature of an hourglass isn't the two wide bulbs.
It's the neck.
That is where the entire system is governed. In that incredibly narrow bottleneck connecting the millions of producers and the billions of consumers sits a tiny, highly concentrated handful of multinational corporations.
They control the flow of the sand.
They own the processing plants, the logistics networks, the seed patents, the chemical fertilizers, and the retail shelf space.
And because they occupy that choke point, they possess this unilateral power to set the rules for both the farmers at the top and the eaters at the bottom.
Right. They set the terms of engagement.
So that structural choke point is exactly what we are unpacking in today's deep dive. We're taking a stack of interdisciplinary research spanning economics, public health, sociology, and anthropology.
To answer a really layered central question.
Right. Who actually controls our food system? Who extracts the profit? Who performs the agonizing labor? Who takes the blame when we get sick? And ultimately, what kind of society does a system like this create?
And to answer that, we really have to start right in the middle of that hourglass.
At the bottleneck.
Yes. We have to examine how the mechanics of modern capitalism, specifically the fiduciary mandate for relentless, quarter-over-quarter corporate growth, collided with human biology.
Because that collision transformed the basic act of biological nourishment into an aggressive profit engine.
Let's look at the foundational problem the food industry faces, which, if you step back and look at human history, is an incredibly bizarre problem to have.
Right, because for millennia, the human struggle was scarcity.
Exactly. Finding enough calories to survive the winter. But the modern industrial food system suffers from the exact opposite crisis.
Overabundance.
We produce entirely too much food. In the United States alone, the food supply chain pumps out roughly 4,000 calories per day per capita.
Wait, 4,000 calories a day for every single person?
Per capita.
Yeah, that is double what the average adult human being actually requires to survive.
Which creates a fascinating, almost existential crisis for a food corporation. You have this massive, unrelenting glut of agricultural commodities.
Like rivers of subsidized corn, soy, and wheat.
Right, just flooding into the market every single harvest cycle. But food corporations face a fundamental biological barrier that, say, a technology company or an apparel brand simply does not have to deal with.
And researchers call this the fixed stomach.
The fixed stomach. Yeah.
I think about this every time I see an earnings report for a massive food conglomerate. No matter how cheap food becomes, no matter how much you discount it, a human being can only physically consume about 1,500 pounds of food in a given year.
That is a hard biological ceiling.
It really is. I mean, it's the ultimate example of inelastic demand.
Think about it in contrast to consumer electronics. If you're a company selling televisions, your market isn't physically limited.
Right. You can convince a consumer that they need a massive flat screen for their living room, a smaller one for the bedroom, one for the kitchen.
maybe a weatherproof one for the patio. You can invent new needs and grow your market volume endlessly.
But you cannot convince a human being to eat 3,000 pounds of food a year.
No, their biological satiety signals will fire, they will feel sick, and eventually their stomach will literally not accept more volume.
So put yourself in the shoes of a corporate executive. You're on an earnings call with Wall Street analysts. They are demanding that your food corporation shows a 5 to 10% growth in profit this year.
But your raw ingredients are dirt cheap because of the agricultural glut.
And your consumer stomach is physically full. It's the equivalent of trying to aggressively sell a second glass of water to a person who is currently drowning.
That is exactly what it is.
So if the consumer cannot physically eat a higher volume of food, how on earth do you extract more profit from them?
You don't increase the volume, you change the math. The industry solution is a concept called adding value. If you are strictly limited to that 1,500-pound biological ceiling per person, your only path to growth is to drastically increase the profit margin on every single ounce of that 1,500 pounds.
Right, you have to take something inherently cheap and transform it into something expensive.
And the mechanism for achieving that is extreme, ultra-processing.
The classic example that perfectly illustrates this from our sources is a simple box of cornflakes.
Oh, let's break down the economics of that box. If you look at the raw physical ingredients inside a standard box of cornflakes, you are looking at a few handfuls of commodity field corn.
Just basic corn.
Just corn. The actual farm value of that raw corn, what the farmer in the top bulb of the hourglass actually received for growing it, is negligible.
It is literally pennies.
Pennies. It represents less than 10% of the retail price you pay at the supermarket.
So how does a corporation justify taking pennies worth of subsidized corn and selling it back to you for $5 or $6?
They pass it through the bottleneck. They apply food science, packaging, and marketing to manufacture value where none inherently existed.
They take that raw, starchy corn matrix and they violently deconstruct it, right?
Precisely. They mill it down to a fine dust. They use high-temperature extrusion to change its physical texture.
And then they engineer it for hyperpalatability. They spray it with added sugars, malt extracts, sodium.
Exactly. Then, because the extreme processing has completely stripped away the natural nutrients, they have to fortify it with synthetic vitamins.
Which allows them to slap a bold health claim on the front of the box.
Right. Fortified with essential vitamins. Finally, they encase it in brightly colored, highly psychological packaging.
Maybe featuring a trusted cartoon mascot.
And back it with a multi-million-dollar advertising campaign.
That process fundamentally rewrites how I understand the aisles of a grocery store, because it means the processed food industry is essentially a supply-driven business.
It completely flips the standard law of supply and demand on its head.
Right. These companies are not inventing extreme cheese-flavored neon orange corn puffs because millions of consumers were marching in the streets demanding them.
No consumer ever inherently craved an ultra-processed, extruded corn puff before it existed.
Right.
The industry formulates these highly engineered products as a mechanism to absorb and market the massive glut of cheap commodities coming off the farms.
The product is the solution to the supply problem.
The goal is entirely about stretching the profit margins of cheap ingredients to satisfy shareholders.
It exposes this profound structural absurdity at the heart of our society. The primary overriding objective of the massive industrial food system is not to nourish you.
Not at all. Providing you with essential vitamins, minerals, and sustained energy is, at best, a secondary byproduct.
The primary objective is to figure out how to chemically and psychologically bypass your natural biological satiety signal.
You have to stretch your appetite.
Right, so you will consume the highest possible volume of their most profitable value-added products.
Which brings us to a really critical inflection point. If these corporations desperately need to capture a larger share of your fixed stomach with their high-profit processed foods, how do they actually ensure that you reach for their ultra-processed snack cake instead of, say, a raw apple?
Right, because relying on television commercials isn't enough.
No, they have to fundamentally alter the physical and economic architecture of the environment you live in.
Let's look at the cold, hard economics of calories, because this is where the choices people make. Choices that are often deeply stigmatized start to make grim, entirely rational sense.
If you analyze the supermarket through the lens of energy return on investment, the landscape is incredibly skewed.
Okay, imagine you have exactly $1 to spend.
Just $1.
And your objective is to acquire the maximum amount of dietary energy to fuel your body. That single dollar can buy you roughly 1,200 calories if you spend it on processed potato chips, cookies, or soda.
But if you take that exact same dollar over to the fresh produce section, its purchasing power just collapses.
Right.
That dollar will only secure you about 250 calories of whole carrots or broccoli.
Wow.
So if you are a head of household managing a severely restricted budget, and you are simply trying to acquire enough caloric energy to keep your family functioning through the week.
Bypassing the produce section for the energy-dense, highly processed aisles is actually the most economically logical decision you can execute. Now, I want to push back on that purely price-driven narrative for a second, because there's a fascinating contradiction in the economic data from the sources.
Okay, what's that?
A major study tracked the relative prices of food over a 25-year period, and they found that if you control for quality and seasonal availability, the raw price of fresh fruits and vegetables actually dropped at almost the exact same rate as the price of junk food over that quarter century.
Really?
Yeah. So if the price of a carrot is falling alongside the price of a cookie, why is ultra-processed food still so overwhelmingly dominant, particularly in marginalized and working-class communities? Is it purely a biological addiction to sugar, or is there a missing variable?
That is a vital piece of pushback. And it highlights why we can't just look at the price tag at the cash register. The missing variable is a sociological concept called time poverty.
Time poverty.
To understand why the cookie wins over the carrot, you have to look at the hidden costs of consumption. Imagine a working-class single parent.
Okay.
They might be stringing together 2 minimum wage shifts just to cover rising rent. They do not own a car, so they rely on a fractured public transit system, adding 2 hours of commuting to their day.
Right.
By the time they get back to their neighborhood at 8 o'clock at night, their physical and mental bandwidth is completely depleted. They are fundamentally time poor.
Exactly. The monetary cost of the carrot might be low, but the temporal and infrastructural cost is massive.
It's huge.
To eat fresh vegetables, you first need access to a fully stocked supermarket, which might be a bus ride away from a divested neighborhood. Then you have to transport the raw ingredients home. You need functional kitchen appliances, knives, cutting boards.
And most importantly, you need the 30 to 40 minutes to wash, peel, chop, and cook the food.
And after all that, you have to spend another 20 minutes scrubbing the pots and pans.
So for that exhausted, time-poor worker, pulling into a brightly lit fast food drive-thru or stopping at a corner bodega to buy a hot, calorie-dense meal for a few dollars is a remarkably efficient, rational solution to their immediate material conditions.
It requires zero preparation time, zero cleanup, and it delivers an immediate, massive payload of caloric energy.
And crucially, it delivers a massive payload of neurological relief.
Right. Fast food isn't just accidental. It is precision engineered by sensory scientists to hit the exact evolutionary buttons our brains are wired to reward.
Because for hundreds of thousands of years, our human ancestors evolved in environments of caloric scarcity.
Finding a dense, rare source of fat or simple sugar meant the difference between surviving the winter or starving.
So our brains evolved to release a flood of dopamine when we encounter those specific macronutrient profiles.
So, when you take a modern human who is chronically stressed, sleep-deprived, and economically anxious, and you hand them a scientifically optimized combination of salt, liquid fat, and high-fructose corn syrup.
You are not just giving them a meal. You are providing a deeply comforting, highly effective neurological salve.
What makes this entire architecture so insidious is how it physically manifests in our geography.
Yes, the dense proliferation of these fast food options in low-income, inner-city neighborhoods wasn't just some spontaneous phenomenon of the free market reacting to consumer desire.
No, we have to examine how the state itself was entirely complicit in constructing this specific food environment.
And to be clear, as we look at the historical record here, we're looking at objective urban planning and economic policy.
Right. This isn't about assigning modern partisan blame to left-wing or right-wing ideologies. It's about understanding the mechanical levers of government policy and how they physically shape the streets we walk on.
Historically, if we look at the period following the urban unrest of the late 1960s, the federal government was looking for ways to stabilize inner-city economies and promote minority business ownership.
Okay.
The mechanism they utilized heavily was the Small Business Administration, a federal agency. The SBA began actively subsidizing and backing loans for fast food franchises to aggressively expand into urban centers.
Wow.
The policy goal was economic development, creating local franchise owners.
But the physical outcome was the permanent embedding of a fast food infrastructure.
Exactly.
Instead of the state utilizing its massive financial leverage to subsidize the construction of full-service supermarkets in underserved neighborhoods, or creating logistical networks for affordable green markets,
Federal loan guarantees structurally incentivize the creation of fast food swamps.
you end up with a compounding structural trap. First, the government heavily subsidizes the massive commodity monocultures, the corn and soy, which makes the raw ingredients for ultra-processed food artificially cheap at the top of the supply chain.
Then, government-backed financial instruments help build the physical fast food restaurants in the most economically vulnerable neighborhoods.
And finally, society acts completely shocked when the people living in those specific neighborhoods, burdened by severe time poverty, end up suffering from diet-related diseases.
Which perfectly sets up the darkest pivot in this entire system.
Yeah. We have just meticulously outlined how this architecture is structurally rigged. It overproduces cheap calories, it scientifically engineers them to bypass our satiety signals, it heavily markets them, and it physically embeds them in communities that lack the time or infrastructure to access alternatives.
Yet, when the inevitable, entirely predictable public health crises arise, when we see skyrocketing population-level rates of obesity, hypertension, and type 2 diabetes, how does the system react?
Who actually takes the fall?
The genius of the modern food system is its ability to protect its profit margins by shifting the entirety of the moral burden onto the individual.
The system gaslights the consumer.
The public relations strategy utilized by the food industry is a masterclass in deflection. Whenever public health advocates push for systemic interventions, things like restricting the aggressive marketing of junk food to young children, implementing taxes on sugary beverages, or demanding clearer front-of-package warning labels, the massive lobbying groups representing food conglomerates deploy a very specific, highly weaponized vocabulary.
They hammer two concepts: personal responsibility and consumer education.
Yes. By framing the issue entirely around personal responsibility, they achieve a massive rhetorical victory. They reframe any attempt to regulate their toxic food environment as an authoritarian attack on personal freedom.
The corporate narrative is essentially, we're not forcing anyone to consume our products. We're merely providing a diverse marketplace of choices.
Right. If individuals are developing metabolic diseases, it is not a structural failure, it is a failure of their own willpower.
They simply need to exercise more, read the nutrition labels closer, and make better personal choices.
It is a devastatingly effective smokescreen. It completely obscures the reality of the supply-driven, state-subsidized, biologically engineered trap we just spent the last 20 minutes detailing.
It allows a multinational corporation to spend billions of dollars chemically engineering a product to be addictive, spend millions more placing it at the eye level of a toddler in the checkout aisle.
And then successfully blame the exhausted parent when the child throws a tantrum for it.
It's incredible. But the mechanism of blame gets exponentially more complex and violent when you realize that personal responsibility is not applied equally across society.
No, not at all. This blame game intersects viciously with race and class. We have to look at how the policing of food choices is used as a tool for social control, particularly through the phenomenon of what researchers call gastronomic surveillance.
Gastronomic surveillance. This concept completely rewired how I view diet culture. It's the idea that society constantly observes, monitors, and judges what people eat, but the severity of that judgment depends entirely on the identity of the person eating.
And nowhere is this more aggressively documented than in the historical and contemporary experiences of Black Americans.
If you examine the historical weaponization of food, you see a deliberate, centuries-long project to construct racist narratives around diet.
Yes. During and after the era of chattel slavery, white supremacy required cultural justifications for the subjugation of Black people.
One of the primary mechanisms used in mass media, minstrel shows, and early advertising was the creation of explicitly racist caricatures linking African Americans to specific foods, most notably fried chicken and watermelon.
And the purpose of those caricatures wasn't just cruel mockery, it was a highly calculated form of psychological control. By endlessly portraying Black people as being biologically driven by uncontrollable base appetites for these specific foods, the dominant culture was manufacturing a narrative of innate inferiority.
It was a way of saying, look, these people lack bodily discipline. They are governed by instinct rather than intellect.
Right. And once you establish the narrative that a group of people is childlike and undisciplined, You have created the social justification for why they need to be surveilled, policed, marginalized, and denied political power.
And we cannot view that as ancient history because that insidious narrative mutated and embedded itself directly into modern dietary advice and the way public health is discussed today.
It absolutely did. The very definition of what constitutes a healthy or respectable diet is deeply racially coded.
Mainstream dietary guidelines and wellness culture frequently elevate what sociologists term white people food, foods like cottage cheese, kale salads, quinoa, and lean poultry, as the ultimate objective standard of health and moral purity.
Meanwhile, traditional Southern food or soul food is routinely and unfairly pathologized.
It is treated as inherently toxic, medically irresponsible, and the primary culprit for health disparities in Black communities.
The hypocrisy required to maintain this narrative is staggering.
Let me offer an analogy to expose the double standard. Consider traditional Italian cuisine. Authentic Italian food can be incredibly heavy. It is frequently loaded with cured, processed meats, massive quantities of rich cheeses, heavy creams, and dense refined carbohydrates.
Oh, absolutely.
Yet Italian food enjoys immense cultural prestige. If a person goes to a high-end restaurant and consumes a massive 3,000-calorie plate of fettuccine alfredo and veal, no one looks at them and assumes they are morally bankrupt or culturally deficient.
No, it is viewed as an indulgence, a celebration of culinary tradition.
But if a Black person is seen consuming a plate of traditional soul food macaroni and cheese, collard greens cooked with pork, fried chicken, it is immediately subjected to a clinical pathologizing gaze.
It is viewed through a lens of societal shame. This surveillance completely erases the incredible culinary ingenuity, the rich regional diversity, and the historical survival strategies that are intricately woven into Southern cooking.
It reduces a complex cultural heritage to a racist biological stereotype, reinforcing the idea that marginalized people are responsible for their own marginalization.
And it isn't just a dynamic operating between different racial groups. Food is actively deployed as a social weapon to enforce class boundaries within communities.
Food operates as a form of cultural capital, signaling who belongs where.
There is a brilliant cultural example of this mechanism from the HBO series The Wire that perfectly encapsulates how environments are designed to exclude.
Oh, you were referring to the scene involving the character Howard Colvin, a police major who takes a group of highly vulnerable, at-risk inner-city middle school boys out to dinner at a high-end, white tablecloth restaurant, Ruth's Chris Steakhouse.
It is an incredibly tense, deeply uncomfortable scene to watch.
These boys are tough. They survive daily trauma on the streets of West Baltimore. They know how to navigate drug corners and violence. But the moment they step into that fine dining establishment, they are completely paralyzed.
They are intimidated by the heavy leather menus, the hushed acoustic atmosphere, the fact that there are 3 different forks at their setting, and the sheer unspoken rules of the space.
The sociologist Pierre Bourdieu describes this phenomenon as a symbolic hierarchy. The boys' discomfort isn't an accident. It is the exact contended function of the restaurant's design.
Fine dining isn't just about the quality of the ingredients. It is an elaborate performance of class.
The obscure culinary terminology, the complex etiquette, the exorbitant prices, these are all mechanisms used to enforce a class boundary.
They serve to signal to certain people that they have arrived at the upper echelons of society, while simultaneously signaling to those boys that they are trespassing in a world that wasn't built for them.
So when we combine all of this, the racial coding of wellness, the class enforcement of fine dining, the constant bodily policing of the poor, we see the true utility of gastronomic surveillance.
By hyper-focusing on the individual choices of the most vulnerable people and framing their heavier bodies or their cultural diets as a moral failure, the broader society gets to wash its hands.
We successfully blame the victims of the food system, which means we never have to interrogate the massive corporations or the government policies that actually architected the system.
If society has successfully shifted all the moral blame onto the consumer in the bottom bulb of the hourglass, it creates a highly convenient smokescreen. It stops us from looking upward.
Because if we actually looked up through the corporate bottleneck and into the top bulb of the hourglass, we would have to confront the brutal physical reality of who is bearing the actual bodily cost of keeping these commodities cheap.
We have to talk about the farm workers, the invisible human beings who are physically subsidizing the entire illusion of the modern supermarket.
To understand this reality, we are looking at intensive ethnographic research conducted on commercial agricultural operations in the United States, specifically focusing on a berry and apple operation in Washington state, often referred to as the Tanaka Farm.
What the research reveals is that the modern commercial farm is not just a workplace. It is a rigid, explicitly racialized caste system.
The labor is structured along a highly specific ethnic and citizenship hierarchy.
At the very top of this hierarchy, insulated from the physical realities of the field, are the farm owners and corporate executives who are almost exclusively white or Asian American U.S. citizens.
Below them, occupying the middle management roles, the administrative assistants, the logistics coordinators, the field supervisors, are often Latino individuals who possess U.S. citizenship or legal residency.
But the hierarchy becomes increasingly stratified and physically punishing the further down you go.
Below the managers, you have undocumented mestizo Mexicans who might be assigned to operate heavy machinery, drive tractors, or work as harvest checkers.
And then, at the absolute bottom of the entire global labor market, performing the most agonizing, biomechanically destructive work of physically picking the berries, you have undocumented indigenous migrants from southern Mexico, specifically populations like the Triqui and Mixtec people.
To understand why the Triqui workers are clustered at the absolute bottom, sociologists use a framework called conjugated oppression.
This is a crucial concept. It means that different forms of marginalization, race, class, citizenship status, indigenous identity, do not just exist parallel to one another. They actively intertwine, compound, and multiply to create uniquely inescapable forms of vulnerability.
A Triqui farm worker is not just exploited because they are economically poor. And they aren't just exploited because they are indigenous.
They're exploited because their poverty, their lack of legal citizenship, their inability to speak English or even mainstream Spanish, and their racial identity all conjugate together.
This makes them the ultimate disposable labor force, unable to unionize, unable to complain to authorities, and easily deported if they push back against the quotas.
The physical manifestation of this conjugated oppression in the fields is staggering. The ethnography paints this unforgettable, visceral tableau of the harvest line.
You have the harvest checker, usually a white or mestizo supervisor, standing completely upright, clipboard in hand, occupying a position of relative physical comfort and absolute authority.
And literally at their feet, kneeling in the wet mud, you have the indigenous Triqui pickers. They are scrambling through the dirt, frantically moving their hands through the thorny bushes, desperate to pick enough berries to meet the merciless minimum weight quotas.
If they fall short, they lose their job and their housing.
And this profound physical inequality, the fact that one human being is standing while another is forced to grovel in the mud for pennies, is normalized through a psychological mechanism called symbolic violence.
Symbolic violence occurs when structural inequality becomes so deeply entrenched and so routinely practiced that society begins to view it as the natural order of the world.
The violence is rendered invisible because everyone, sometimes even the marginalized themselves, accepts it as just the way things are.
There is an anecdote from the farm that perfectly captures the horror of symbolic violence. The researchers describe a day when a sudden, heavy rainstorm hits the farm.
A group of indigenous Triqui women, seeking temporary shelter from the downpour, huddle under the small roof overhang of the main farm office.
The farm manager, a white woman, steps out of the office, sees them standing near her landscaping, and starts yelling, "What are you doing standing in my flowers? Shoo, shoo, get."
She literally waves her hands and physically shoos them away, utilizing the exact tone and body language one would use to scare off a pack of stray dogs or nuisance animals.
It is a moment of absolute casual dehumanization. It demonstrates how the system does not view these workers as human beings deserving of shelter, but merely as biological machines imported to extract value from the soil.
And that dehumanization fundamentally corrupts how society and the medical system view the physical injuries these workers sustain.
A Triqui worker will systematically destroy their knees, their spinal discs, and their hips from years of repetitive kneeling, bending, and carrying massive weights in the fields.
But instead of the system recognizing that its labor practices are physically destroying human bodies, society looks at a broken indigenous worker and invents a biological rationalization.
Supervisors and even local medical professionals will genuinely say things like, well, the Triqui people are generally shorter in stature, so their bodies are just naturally built for being lower to the ground. They are suited for this kind of work.
It is pure social Darwinism used as a shield against moral culpability. By convincing ourselves that their bodies are biologically destined for agonizing, low-to-the-ground labor, the structural violence becomes invisible.
The consumer at the supermarket doesn't have to feel any guilt about the suffering of the migrant worker because the culture has provided a convenient narrative that the worker is exactly where nature intended them to be.
But if we want to understand why the conditions on that Tanaka farm are so relentless, we have to look back at the bottleneck of our hourglass.
Why is the pressure on these workers so intense? It isn't just because one specific farm manager is cruel. It is because of the mechanical squeeze exerted by the global supermarket oligopolies.
This is where the macroeconomics dictate the micro-suffering. The massive multinational retailers, sitting in the neck of the hourglass, the Walmarts, the Carrefours, the massive grocery conglomerates, wield immense, almost sovereign market power.
They act as the ultimate gatekeepers to the consumer.
So the buyer for a massive supermarket chain can go to a supplier, say a mid-sized fruit farm in Washington state, and relentlessly squeeze them on the wholesale price.
The supermarket demands perfectly unblemished, uniform fruit available 365 days a year at absolute rock-bottom prices.
And if the farmer refuses, the supermarket simply sources the food from a different continent.
The independent farm owner is trapped. They are feeling this immense downward financial pressure from the corporate bottleneck. To keep their farm from going bankrupt, they have to slash their operational costs.
And in agriculture, the most flexible cost is always labor. So the farm owner pushes the squeeze downward.
They freeze wages, they increase the speed of the harvest quotas, they reduce break times, and they degrade the living conditions in the migrant labor camps.
It exposes a massive, glaring contradiction in the psyche of the modern consumer.
We walk into the supermarket and we demand the impossible. We want ethically sourced, organic, perfectly ripe produce available in the dead of winter, but we absolutely refuse to tolerate the retail prices that would actually be required to pay a living wage, provide health insurance, and ensure safe working conditions for the farm worker pulling it from the ground.
We want to feel morally superior about our food choices, but we demand that our morality be heavily discounted.
Human bodies are literally being ground down to absorb the true cost of our cheap produce. But it isn't just human bodies in the fields.
The physical environment, our global water systems, and public health at a planetary scale are also bearing the hidden costs of this system.
If we shift our focus from the produce fields to the industrial meat sector, we see how agribusiness corporations operate by externalizing their most massive existential risks.
When we discuss the industrialization of animal agriculture, we are primarily talking about the rise of CAFO's concentrated animal feeding operations.
The logic of the factory assembly line was applied directly to living, breathing biology.
You have corporations constructing massive football field-sized warehouses designed to hold 50,000 turkeys, or 250,000 broiler chickens crammed together under a single artificially lit roof.
Now, you don't need a PhD in epidemiology to realize that stuffing 250,000 genetically identical, highly stressed, immunocompromised birds into a single, poorly ventilated warehouse sounds like an apocalyptic idea.
And from a biological perspective, it absolutely is. Researchers who study the intersection of agriculture and virology refer to these massive CAFOs not as economies of scale, but as diseconomies of scale.
The terminology is precise. A factory might get more efficient the larger it gets, but biological systems become exponentially more fragile.
When you crowd that many genetically uniform animals together, you have effectively built the world's most perfect incubator for rapidly mutating pathogens.
If a highly pathogenic strain of avian influenza enters that barn, it doesn't just spread, it accelerates. It can rip through a flock of 250,000 birds in a matter of days, resulting in massive die-offs.
This brings up a massive logical paradox. If operating a CAFO is inherently unstable, if it is a biological powder keg prone to catastrophic, multi-million-dollar failures, why do the smartest, most ruthlessly calculating agribusiness executives continue to utilize this model?
Because the corporations found a financial loophole, they do not assume the risk.
They engineered a system that completely insulates their balance sheets from the biological reality of the barns. And they do this through a ubiquitous legal mechanism called contract farming.
The financial mechanics of contract farming are brilliant and deeply predatory. Let's walk through exactly how this functions.
The massive multi-billion-dollar agribusiness corporation maintains ownership of all the high-value proprietary assets. They own the patented genetics of the chicks, they own the specific formulation of the feed, they own the slaughterhouses and the logistics network.
But crucially, they refuse to own the physical land, the actual barns, or the daily labor of raising the animals. They contract that messy, misky part out to a local, legally independent farmer.
The corporation approaches a farmer in a rural, economically depressed area and offers them a contract. but the requirements are staggeringly expensive.
The corporation dictates that the farmer must take out a massive, often multi-million-dollar commercial loan from a bank to construct 3 or 4 massive barns that meet the corporation's exact proprietary, constantly updating specifications.
The corporation then drops off the day-old chicks in the feed and says, "We will be back in 6 weeks to pick up the grown birds, and we will pay you a fraction of a cent per pound of meat."
Researchers who study this system call these contract farmers trap crops. It's an agricultural term for a plant you put on the edge of a field to attract pests away from your valuable cash crop. The contract farmer exists to attract and absorb the financial and biological risk.
Think about the day a pathogen hits. If everything goes perfectly smoothly, the corporation retrieves the fully grown birds, processes them, sells them to the supermarket, and captures the massive retail profit, leaving the farmer with barely enough to service their bank debt.
But what happens if an outbreak of avian flu hits the barn in week 4? The corporation orders the entire flock of 250,000 birds to be culled and incinerated.
For the massive agribusiness, that cull represents a minor temporary inventory loss on a sprawling spreadsheet. They just divert processing to a different region.
But for the contract farmer, it is total, unmitigated financial ruin. They have no product to sell, zero income for the cycle, yet they still owe the local bank millions of dollars for the empty, contaminated barns. The corporation effectively privatized the profits while socializing the risk onto the back of the independent contractor.
And that precise mechanism, privatizing profit and socializing risk, is exactly how the industrial food system treats the environment and the public sector. Economists call this externalizing costs.
An externality is simply a cost generated by a business operation that the business manages to avoid paying, forcing society to foot the bill instead.
The scale of these externalities is staggering. Let's look at the waste. A single CAFO holding millions of animals produces more raw, untreated feces and urine than a major human city.
But unlike a city, there is no massive municipal water treatment plant. The waste is simply pumped into massive open-air, unlined cesspools, politely referred to as lagoons.
And those lagoons are a ticking time bomb. When extreme weather events occur, which are becoming more frequent, those systems fail catastrophically.
There are heavily documented instances, such as in the Cape Fear River Basin in North Carolina, where hurricanes have caused these massive earthen lagoons to breach.
Millions of gallons of highly toxic, untreated animal waste, loaded with nitrates and antibiotic-resistant bacteria, wash directly into the local waterways.
It causes massive fish kills, destroys local ecosystems, and severely contaminates the drinking water supply for surrounding communities.
But the crucial point is the accounting. When that lagoon breaches, the agribusiness corporation whose animals produce the waste does not swoop in with a blank check.
They do not pay for the environmental remediation of the river. They do not pay the medical bills for the local residents who develop respiratory or gastrointestinal illnesses.
They do not pay the billions of dollars required for a global public health response when a proto-pandemic influenza inevitably leaps from a crowded feedlot into the human population.
Those massive civilization-level costs are completely externalized. They are paid for by local municipalities, by taxpayer-funded emergency services, and by the bodies of the global public. The corporation internalizes the profit. The world absorbs the risk.
We have spent the last hour dissecting a deeply broken, highly industrialized modern food system. We've seen how it is driven by relentless profit, how it relies on racial and class inequity, how it breaks the bodies of its workers, and how it pushes the environment to the brink of collapse.
It forces us to step back and ask a fundamental existential question. Does it have to be this way? Is this the only way human beings can feed themselves? Or have we lost something profound?
To understand what we have lost and to see what alternatives might exist outside the capitalist framework, we have to take the long view.
We have to look at the anthropological research on traditional diets and the few remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth, specifically groups like the Hadza people living in the Rift Valley of Tanzania.
Studying the Hadza is incredibly illuminating, primarily because it completely demolishes the modern, commercialized myths about how our ancient ancestors ate.
In the West, we have this massive lucrative diet industry built around the so-called paleo diet. The commercial paleo narrative pushes this highly stylized fiction that early humans were apex carnivores who ate massive quantities of grain-fed ribeye steaks and strictly avoided all carbohydrates, grains, and legumes.
But when anthropologists actually embed with contemporary foraging societies like the Hadza, The biological reality is radically different. Ancient humans and modern foragers do not eat farm-raised beef. They are the ultimate generalists.
They eat a hyper-diverse, intensely seasonal, incredibly varied diet based entirely on what the immediate environment provides.
Depending on the season and the rainfall, a Hadza forager's diet might consist of heavily fibrous tubers dug from the hard earth, which require immense chewing and digestion.
The next month, it might rely on various berries and baobab fruit. They might consume catfish caught from a receding lake or small game like hyrax and porcupine.
And when they can find it, they consume massive amounts of liquid honey, which is pure, unrefined sugar.
The biological outcome of this hyperdiverse whole food diet is a revelation for modern medicine. Because they are consuming such a wide variety of complex plant fibers and wild microbes, the gut microbiome of a Hadza forager is vastly more diverse, robust, and resilient than the microbiome of an average urbanite eating a Western ultra-processed diet.
Their bodies are adapted to process complexity, whereas the industrial diet feeds us pre-digested, extruded simplicity.
But the true lesson of traditional diets isn't just about the types of food consumed. It is about what happens when global capitalism violently collides with these adapted biological systems.
We see this devastating collision in a phenomenon that epidemiologists call the nutrition transition.
The nutrition transition is a massive population-level metabolic shock. Let's look at pastoralist societies like the Maasai in East Africa, whose traditional diet for centuries consisted almost entirely of cow's milk, raw blood, and meat.
Or the historical Inuit populations in the Arctic, who survived in sub-zero environments on a diet composed almost entirely of pure animal fat and sea mammals like seal and whale, consuming virtually zero plant matter.
Now, if you evaluate those traditional diets against the standard USDA food pyramid, they look like a recipe for immediate cardiac arrest and severe vitamin deficiency.
But paradoxically, historical data shows that these populations were incredibly healthy. Because their metabolisms had adapted over generations to their specific environments, they exhibited almost zero incidence of modern metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes or heart disease.
Until the nutrition transition occurs, the tragedy begins when these indigenous populations are politically or economically pushed off their ancestral lands.
They might be displaced by the creation of national parks, or their traditional hunting grounds are swallowed by industrial agriculture.
Suddenly, they are forced to participate in a cash economy. They can no longer forage or herd. They have to buy their calories from a local store. And what is the cheapest, most accessible food available in that globalized supply chain?
Refined white flour, highly processed vegetable oils, and refined sugar.
The metabolic results are catastrophic. When you take a population whose biology is perfectly adapted to traditional foraging or pastoralism, and you suddenly flood their system with ultra-processed, hyperglycemic industrial foods, their health plummets almost overnight.
The rates of obesity, tooth decay, type 2 diabetes, and cardiovascular disease absolutely skyrocketed. It is the definitive proof that it is not necessarily the specific macronutrients, fat versus carbs, that are destroying our health. It is the industrial processing and the violent separation from our ecological context.
But beyond the biological devastation, looking at a society like the Hadza reveals a profound philosophical contrast in how food is valued. It challenges the very economic foundations of our supermarket.
When Western capitalist-trained economists and anthropologists first began studying Hadza hunting practices, they tried to map our transactional mindset onto their behavior.
They observed a hunter killing an animal, bringing it back to the camp, and distributing the meat among the group. The Western observers assumed this was a primitive form of economics, that the hunter was building social currency, establishing debt, and expecting a future return on his investment.
But they were fundamentally projecting their own capitalist conditioning. The research shows that for the Hadza, a killed animal is absolutely not considered personal property to be hoarded or traded. It is viewed as a public good.
The meat is shared equally among the entire camp based on need, without any transactional economy. There is no ledger being kept. No one owes anyone a debt. The food is a communal right, not a tradable asset.
Contrast that with the system we outlined at the beginning of this deep dive. The capitalist food system has relentlessly commodified every single calorie on the planet.
Food has been systematically stripped of its cultural resonance, its communal bonding power, and its spiritual significance, and reduced entirely to a standardized, tradable financial asset on a futures market.
This total commodification is what allows the system to alienate us from the natural world, alienate us from the invisible labor of the farm worker, and ultimately alienate us from each other.
But, and this is a vital piece of critical analysis, we cannot fall into the trap of simply romanticizing the past. We cannot look at the Hadza and naively declare that the solution to our industrial nightmare is for all of us to abandon the cities and return to the forest to forage for tubers.
Precisely, because the mathematical and physical realities of the hunter-gatherer lifestyle are brutal. The infant mortality rates in foraging societies are historically tragic. Life is physically precarious, and more importantly, the carrying capacity of the land is incredibly low.
It requires roughly 1,000 hectares of wild, uncultivated land to sustain a single human forager for a year.
The math just doesn't work. If a modern industrialized nation like the UK suddenly abolished agriculture and attempted to return to a hunter-gatherer existence, the entire landmass of the country could only support about 25,000 people.
The global population is currently 8 billion and climbing. We absolutely need the technologies of agriculture. We need the ability to produce food at scale. We cannot escape the necessity of mass production.
Which leaves us with the ultimate, unresolved tension of our modern era. Is it possible to design a global food system that possesses the immense scale required to feed 8 billion human beings, but is simultaneously ethical in its labor practices, ecologically sustainable in its methods, and genuinely nourishing for the human body?
Or does the demand for massive scale inherently require exploitation and extreme processing?
Let's synthesize the massive journey we have just taken. We started by stepping through the automatic doors of the supermarket, challenging the naive illusion that our diets are simply matters of personal choice.
We visualize the hourglass, uncovering how a tiny bottleneck of corporate conglomerates utilizes extreme processing to forcefully squeeze endless profit out of the biological limits of the human stomach.
We analyzed how the physical architecture of cheap food, historically backed by state policy and urban planning, rationally exploits the exhaustion and time poverty of the working class.
We deconstructed the insidious nature of gastronomic surveillance, exposing how the system uses racial coding and class markers to shift the moral blame from the toxic environment onto the individual consumer.
We looked down through the neck of the hourglass to witness the conjugated oppression of the undocumented farm workers, realizing that our demand for cheap, perfect produce is subsidized entirely by their broken bodies and invisible labor.
We examined the financial traps of contract farming and the massive ecological risks that agribusiness externalizes onto the public, while the tragedy of the nutrition transition showed us the biological cost of commodifying our calories.
All of which forces us back to the central, animating question of this entire exploration. What is food ultimately for? In the industrialized, heavily financialized system we currently inhabit, food is primarily engineered to be a vehicle for corporate profit and a mechanism for social control.
But historically, for the vast, overwhelming majority of human existence, food was fundamentally for nourishment, for deep sensory pleasure, for biological survival, and for forging the communal bonds that hold a society together.
We are rapidly approaching a crossroads where we will have to decide which version of the food system we want to carry into the future.
And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to consider a logical endpoint of the trajectory we are currently on. Right now, billions of dollars in venture capital are flowing into the development of precision fermentation and lab-grown synthetic food.
The goal is to eventually bypass agriculture entirely, synthesizing perfectly customized proteins and carbohydrates in massive urban bioreactors.
It is the ultimate technological solution to the messy biological constraints of the hourglass.
But if we remove the soil, the sun, and the farm worker entirely, and we synthesize all our calories at a corporate laboratory, who holds the patent on your survival?
If the modern supermarket gave us the illusion of choice while subtly controlling our habits, imagine a future where a tech conglomerate literally owns the proprietary source code to the exact chemical composition of your next meal.
Would that finally free us from the exploitation of the land, or would it simply make the bottleneck of the hourglass so narrow that we can never escape it?
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden architecture of your food. Next time those automatic doors slide open and you step into that dazzling fluorescent light, remember, food is never just food.
The submitted manuscript provides a really comprehensive overview of the field of food politics and political economy by synthesizing foundational texts from authors like Rob Wallace, Robert Parberg, Psyche Williams-Forson, and Julian Baggini.
And, the author demonstrates just a deep, really impressive command of the source material. The baseline strength of this manuscript is so high that we are going to completely bypass basic structural edits today.
Right, we're diving straight into a probing, unsparing intellectual interrogation of the field's underlying assumptions to elevate this from a good summary to a groundbreaking critique. So, getting right into it, the manuscript powerfully diagnoses systemic injustices in the food system, but it frequently overstates corporate intentionality and flattens complex agricultural challenges entirely into critiques of capitalism.
Yeah, that is a huge point. The weakness here is that by relying so heavily on the structural frameworks of authors like Rob Wallace and Raj Patel, the draft ends up portraying agribusiness and global trade almost exclusively as these malicious forces exploiting the vulnerable.
Like a cartoon villain.
Exactly. It's an ideologically narrow angle. It treats capitalism as the sole villain, and in doing so, it completely neglects the genuine logistical dilemmas of scale, affordability, and, the immense coordination required to feed billions of people.
I mean, 8 billion people. It's a staggering logistical reality.
Right. So the manuscript is much stronger on exposing injustice than it is on grappling with the really difficult trade-offs of abundance and technological efficiency.
So the suggestion for improvement here would be to broaden the analytical angle to actively interrogate the limits of this anti-capitalist narrative.
Yes, absolutely. The author needs to deliberately compare these structural critiques against market-oriented and policy-realist perspectives.
Just to show that scale and global trade sometimes serve necessary coordinating functions rather than just being, instruments of corporate greed.
Precisely. And for concrete examples, the author could contrast Wallace's assertion that agribusiness inherently drives environmental ruin and pandemics with Robert Palberg's observation.
Oh, right, Palberg's point about consumer demand.
Exactly. He notes that post-industrial food systems evolved largely to meet consumer demands for cheap, varied, and convenient food. It wasn't just a smoky backroom conspiracy to destroy the earth.
People wanted affordable food. And the author should definitely incorporate Palberg's point about authoritarian states, too.
Oh, that's a brilliant counterpoint.
Right. We have to remind the reader that the absolute worst famines in history, places like China, North Korea, Somalia, they occurred in non-democratic societies lacking market coordination. That completely complicates the idea that capitalist agribusiness is the root of all starvation.
It really does. And to push that even further, use David Harvey's warning. Wallace actually cites him, but the draft misses the implication. Completely rolling back agribusiness infrastructure would likely trigger the very types of famines that predated industrial development.
Which leads me to a really specific pushback on this. If we dismantle the corporate agribusiness infrastructure entirely, as these structural critiques suggest, don't we inherently risk triggering the massive pre-industrial famines that David Harvey warned about?
Yes, and the author has to let the reader sit with that uncomfortable reality.
So, moving on to the second main issue. Having established that the manuscript needs to grapple with the realities of scale rather than just attacking corporate infrastructure, the critique must logically examine the alternative models the manuscript proposes.
The alternatives, right.
While the text rightly exposes the flaws of industrial agriculture, it uncritically romanticizes traditional, local, and paleo diets without addressing their stark limitations regarding global scalability and policy realism.
I mean, it really does. The weakness is how the submission highlights Julian Baggini's exploration of the Hadza hunter-gatherer lifestyle and, the allure of local food movements championed by figures like Michael Pollan.
Sure, the Eat Local movement.
Right, but it treats these localized whole food traditions as these sacred cures for our broken food world. It completely ignores the carrying capacity of the land and the simple fact that these models cannot support current global populations.
So treating the Hadza hunter-gatherer diet as a scalable policy solution is basically like trying to solve modern traffic congestion by suggesting everyone ride horses. It's a beautiful, natural ideal that completely collapses under the weight of modern population density.
That is such a perfect analogy. And so the suggestion for improvement is to interrogate that romanticization of localism. Introduce a constructively skeptical view of traditional diets by incorporating empirical data on population density and the environmental necessity of high-yield farming.
And we can offer some really concrete examples for how to do this. First, integrate Baggini's stark mathematical reality.
Oh, the land requirement data?
Right. A hunter-gatherer lifestyle requires 1,000 hectares per person.
Wow.
Yeah. So point out that under this model, the UK could only support 25,000 people.
You'd literally be requiring the elimination of over 96% of its current population.
That is sobering demographic realism right there.
Absolutely. Another concrete example is to use Alyssa Crittenden's research, which is also from the Bajini text, to completely debunk the paleo diet myth.
Right, because early humans were just generalists. They ate whatever was available. The strict modern paleo diets lack an actual scientific basis. It's largely an invention of modern wellness culture.
Exactly. And finally, introduce Paarlberg's environmental argument regarding land sparing. If we fail to utilize high-yield, technology-assisted farming, especially in places like Africa, it will result in massive deforestation and wildlife habitat destruction, simply because low-yield farming requires vastly more land to produce the same amount of calories.
Which brings us to an interesting shift in the manuscript's tone. Because these alternative, local models are practically unscalable for the masses, the food movement often ends up blaming the masses for not adopting them, which leads directly to the third major issue in the manuscripts, its tone toward the consumer.
Right. The current draft possesses a strong moral force, but it inadvertently adopts an elitist, moralizing tone toward consumer behavior that treats ordinary people as passive victims needing reform.
It really does. The weakness is that by leaning so heavily into the critiques of the Eat More environment outlined by Marion Nestle, the text actually begins to sound like the food police.
Which is so alienating.
Completely. It moralizes consumer behavior while simultaneously claiming not to. It treats ordinary people as dupes of the system, and frankly, it fails to respect human pleasure, culinary meaning, cultural aspiration, and the socioeconomic realities of diverse communities.
So the standard public health critique of processed foods is obviously important. But I have a challenging question. Does the literature featured in this manuscript pay enough attention to the joy, pleasure, and cultural meaning of food, or does it risk turning every meal into a grim political calculus where justice is treated as a self-explanatory answer?
That is exactly the trap the author falls into. And the suggestion for improvement is to rebalance the tone by synthesizing Psyche Williams-Forson's perspective.
Right, acknowledging that people have complex, personal values.
Yes, the author needs to state clearly that people should not be shamed for making food choices that fail to fit rigid, organic, local, or fair trade ideals.
So giving some concrete examples for improvement here, the author could incorporate Williams-Forson's citation of Lisa Heldka's litmus test for ethical food consumers.
Oh, I love that part of the literature.
Yeah, it points out how the demand to eat local or eat organic basically reduces moral life to a set of rigid, privileged choices.
And the author should definitely quote agricultural economist Jason Lusk's concept of the food police.
Explain that for a second.
It's the idea of this self-appointed elite within the movement who seek the power to steer food choice, essentially claiming to know better than consumers themselves. It's a really paternalistic dynamic.
Totally. And finally, the text should highlight that consuming globally sourced processed foods from specialty ethnic markets, things like jasmine rice, palm oil, or Maggi cubes, can be a vital expression of cultural survival and diaspora identity.
Right. It's not just a symptom of corporate manipulation. For a lot of immigrant families, that processed imported food is a direct connection to home. Shaming that choice is incredibly tone-deaf.
It really is. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. To quickly recap, this manuscript is a masterful synthesis of food politics literature. But to reach its full potential, it must actively interrogate the field's recurring blind spots.
Namely, the overstatement of corporate malice, the romanticization of localism, and the moralizing of consumer choice.
And to summarize the actionable suggestions we've outlined, to strengthen the work, the author should incorporate Paarlberg's economic trade-offs to balance those structural critiques.
Yes, and use Bajini's carrying capacity data to ground localist fantasies in stark demographic realism.
And finally, apply Williams-Forson's anti-shaming framework to humanize the consumer and celebrate culinary pleasure. We really want to thank the listener for submitting such intellectually serious material to the critique.
Absolutely. And we warmly invite you to submit your revised draft back to the critique for further exploration once you've had a chance to work through these tensions.
Until then, keep questioning the consensus.